How can you frighten a man whose hunger is not only in his own cramped stomach, but in the wretched bellies of his children? You can't scare him. He has known a fear beyond every other. John Steinbeck.
Oh, hi. Mr. Lahasky here. And today, we'll see the United States contend with the biggest economic crisis of the 20th century, the Great Depression. The 1920s was a decade of growth and prosperity. A modern America was emerging, and many believed that the rapid growth of the economy would continue in perpetuity. But by the end of the decade, the allure of modernity was masking cracks in the very foundation of the economic and financial system. When that foundation finally gave way, the country was thrown into disarray. And the economic crisis of the 1930s changed American life in fundamental ways. Today, we'll explore those changes. But first, a big question. Should the president be in charge of the U.S. economy? Given today's political discourse, this question seems almost rhetorical. American presidents are inextricably connected to the economy. Separate studies in 2011 and 2015 found that economic performance in the 9 months leading up to a presidential election is one of the most reliable predictors of that election's outcome. Incumbent presidents relish in the economic gains during their tenure, and challengers ceaselessly promise more jobs and higher wages if elected. But this trend has not always characterized presidential politics. During the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became the first president to seize major control of and responsibility for the American economy. He expanded the federal government's power and presence in economic matters and changed the very perception of the presidency along the way. But the question begs, does executive control of the U.S. economy place too much power in the hands of one person? Does it undermine the checks and balances that the founders were so meticulous to create? Or is it a necessary response to an economy that has grown in size and scope beyond the wildest imaginations of those founders? Let's look inside the Great Depression, then you decide. Our first big idea outlines the major causes of the Great Depression, of which there were many. The Great Depression was caused by many of the underlying economic trends of the 1920s: a widening wealth gap, a troubled farm economy, laissez-faire economic policy, the excessive use of credit, and widespread stock speculation. In October of 1929, the American stock market collapsed, triggering nationwide panics and the evaporation of billions of dollars. Many associate the Great Depression with this stock market crash, but we should note here that the crash of the stock market was only part of the broader economic collapse. Indeed, the Depression traces a number of causes. Most relate to the underlying trends of the Roaring '20s. First, economists and historians point out that during the 1920s, the wealth gap was still very pronounced. In 1929, the top 5% of Americans commanded over a third of all annual income. While the middle class did emerge during the 20s, it was not growing fast enough to keep up with the mass production of consumer goods. As a result, sales of these goods began to slow in the later part of the decade. Second, the farm economy was problematic throughout the 20s. After World War I, government protections for farmers disappeared and the global food supply recovered. This drove prices down and more American farmers found themselves in a never-ending cycle of debt. The need to purchase expensive machinery combined with the falling crop prices forced American farmers into a corner, threatening a massive sector of the U.S. economy. Third, a string of Republican presidents in the 1920s returned to the laissez-faire policies of the Gilded Age. Now, while this hands-off approach did permit significant economic growth during the decade, it also contributed to the wealth gap. Furthermore, the lack of government regulation allowed companies to engage in risky and sometimes fraudulent financial practices. And among those risky practices was the excessive issuance and use of credit. During the 20s, banks and merchants extended lots of credit to American consumers, increasing their purchasing power by allowing them to buy now and pay later. While this boosted the consumer economy, many Americans used credit and installment plans to live beyond their means. Historians estimate that 65% of vacuum cleaners, 75% of radios, and over 80% of furniture was purchased with installment plans or credit in the 1920s. As Americans' debts rose, the country's economic foundation weakened. And then, of course, there was the stock market. During the 1920s, Wall Street saw record gains. The rapid growth of stock values gave the impression that America had entered a new era of prosperity and that the profits would never max out. This led to widespread speculation, the risky practice of buying and selling stocks for short-term profit rather than long-term investment. Many middle-class Americans wanted in on the action, and brokers allowed them to buy stocks with credit, a practice called buying on margin. When Wall Street recognized that a speculative bubble had caused inflated stock prices, a sell-off began. In 2 days in late October 1929, the market lost nearly a quarter of its value. Investors panicked as prices fell, and the crisis quickly snowballed. Americans rushed to withdraw their savings from banks, and these bank runs quickly depleted cash reserves. Many arrived too late, only to find that their bank had lost everything and closed its doors permanently. Consumer spending came to a screeching halt, forcing manufacturers and retailers out of business and causing the unemployment rate to skyrocket. The Great Depression had begun. The Depression caused unprecedented hardship in the United States. We could spend an entire semester on the losses and struggles of the American citizenry, but in the interest of time, we'll outline just a few. Here's our second big idea. The hardship of the Great Depression was underscored by unemployment, homelessness, and poverty. For a privileged few, the Depression was an inconvenience. For the masses, it was life-altering. At its peak in the early 1930s, the unemployment rate climbed to 25%. Nearly half of all American households faced unemployment or underemployment. Over 9,000 banks closed during the Depression, and hundreds of thousands of Americans lost their life savings along with them. As unemployed Americans lost their homes to eviction and foreclosure, homelessness skyrocketed. Homeless communities emerged on the outskirts of cities. They were begrudgingly called Hoovervilles, a not-so-subtle jab at the American president who oversaw the crash. A new hobo subculture emerged during the Depression, when nearly 4 million Americans stowed away on railway cars in search of work across the country. On Western farms, things were even worse. The economic problems were compounded by the Dust Bowl, the result of decades of overcultivation followed by drought. Plagues of grasshoppers, jackrabbits, and other pests made farmers' lives a living hell. In 1933, 200,000 families lost their farms to foreclosure. To sum it up, things were really, really bad. In their desperation, Americans increasingly looked to the government for action. When the Depression hit, President Herbert Hoover resisted intervention. He insisted that the Depression would be temporary and that market forces would right the ship. But as the crisis deepened, the American people lost patience with the conservative approach. In 1932, they elected his Democratic challenger, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt would go on to transform the presidency and, as it turns out, the country. This is our third big idea. Herbert Hoover's economic policies led to his ousting in 1932. His successor, Franklin D. Roosevelt, transformed the role of the president by taking personal responsibility for the American economy. FDR's New Deal programs drastically increased the size and scope of the federal government in order to provide relief, recovery, and reform. To put things lightly, Herbert Hoover's economic policies during the Depression fell short of the mark. The Hawley-Smoot tariff, passed in 1930, was intended to protect American manufacturers, but retaliatory tariffs from Europe slowed international trade and deepened the crisis. Hoover also attempted to distance the U.S. from financial affairs in Europe, but this too had a damaging effect. But Hoover's lowest moment as president probably came in 1932, when struggling World War I veterans marched on Washington, D.C. The former soldiers were owed bonuses for their time in the service, but were not due to receive them until 1945. Their demonstration at the Capitol was designed to pressure Congress to issue those payments sooner. The so-called bonus army made camp on the National Mall. But when violence with police led to 2 fatalities, the president ordered U.S. Army General Douglas MacArthur to clear the encampment, which he did with tanks and tear gas. Needless to say, Hoover's treatment of the bonus army did not help his cause with the American people, and in November of 1932, they voted for change. Franklin D. Roosevelt was a Democrat from New York who had been active in economic reform efforts as governor of that state. His election to the presidency in 1932 had incredible consequences for the future of American governance. Roosevelt appealed to voters by promising action, big action. In his inaugural address, he pledged for the American people a New Deal, one that would provide a safety net and a path forward. He vowed to work with Congress, but also asserted the power of his own office to effect change in the economy. Indeed, Roosevelt revolutionized the presidency. He broke down barriers by communicating directly to the people on radio broadcasts known as fireside chats. He established the first 100 days as a benchmark for progress towards his goals, a benchmark that has been used ever since to gauge a president's effectiveness. And Roosevelt was effective. 13 major laws or programs were established in his first 3 months as president. They were all part of the New Deal he had promised. The New Deal consisted of a plethora of new laws, new government agencies, and new programs intended to reverse the negative effects of the Great Depression. The New Deal had 3 major goals, outlined by the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief programs were short-term measures designed to stop the bleeding and provide immediate aid to struggling Americans. The most notable of Roosevelt's actions to this end involved the banking system. Roosevelt recognized that the failure of the banking system precluded meaningful economic recovery. Accordingly, the banking crisis was his top priority. In March 1933, Roosevelt declared a bank holiday, which closed banks nationwide in order to ease panic and stop the bank runs that were driving them out of business. Days later, the Emergency Banking Act allowed for solvent banks to reopen, with a guarantee that deposits would be insured by the federal government. The relief measure worked. Consumer confidence in the banking system was restored, and the bank runs slowed down. Another noteworthy relief initiative was the Federal Emergency Relief Act, which, among other things, provided cash payments to the unemployed and distributed money to state and local governments for targeted use. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, or AAA, was a relief program that targeted farmers by paying them to plow their fields under. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, or AAA, was a relief program that targeted farmers by paying them to plow their fields under. This gave farmers much needed cash and helped to stabilize crop prices by controlling supply. The next phase of the New Deal was recovery. Recovery programs were designed to prime the economic pump by getting people back to work. More people with a steady income, Roosevelt believed, would stimulate consumer spending and get the economy rolling in the right direction. The overwhelming focus of recovery programs was job creation. Here are 3 examples of the most successful of these efforts. The Works Progress Administration was a new government agency which gave people jobs building schools, bridges, ballparks, and other infrastructure. The Civilian Conservation Corps put people to work in the national parks, forging trails and responding to natural disasters. And the Tennessee Valley Authority employed people to build dams and electrical infrastructure in the rural and undeveloped parts of the Tennessee River Valley. Historians estimate that New Deal recovery programs like these employed more than 20 million people during the first half of the 1930s. The final category of New Deal programs was reform. Reform measures were designed to prevent future economic crises by solving the problems that led to the Great Depression. Reform programs often involved increased regulation of the financial system and new protections for individuals. 3 examples explain. The Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, was established to regulate Wall Street and prevent out-of-control speculation, insider trading, and other fraudulent activities that contributed to the 1929 stock market crash. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, provided a guarantee of bank deposits in order to restore confidence in banks across the country. And the Social Security Administration provided a financial safety net for American citizens in retirement. Each of these reform programs still play a vital role in our economy today. Now, while the New Deal did put millions of Americans back to work and established protections against future crises, it was not universally accepted. Roosevelt, though popular, faced criticism from both sides of the political spectrum. This is our 4th big idea. Roosevelt's New Deal was criticized by conservatives who argued that the deficit spending and government expansion undermined American ideals, but also by some liberals who argued that his programs did not do enough to solve America's economic problems. Historians generally credit FDR for his leadership through the Depression, but the New Deal wasn't perfect, and it was not without its detractors. Conservatives balked at the massive expansion of the federal government and executive power that the New Deal represented. While Roosevelt's party controlled the White House and Congress, the Supreme Court was benched by conservatives that struck down a number of the president's initiatives. In United States v. Butler, the court declared the Agricultural Adjustment Act unconstitutional, forcing the president to replace it. The court also struck down the National Industrial Recovery Act, stripping Roosevelt of regulatory authority and weakening protections for workers. These rulings were such a thorn in Roosevelt's side that the president launched a campaign to pack the Supreme Court by adding more justices that he would be able to select. While FDR's court-packing plan ultimately failed, it illustrates the resistance he faced from the conservative judiciary. Conservative politicians also objected to the New Deal, and this opposition crossed party lines. The Bipartisan American Liberty League was formed in 1934. Its members criticized FDR's expansion of the federal government and expressed fear that the country was on a path towards socialism. In 1937, a document entitled the Conservative Manifesto was leaked to the New York Times by members of both parties. It called for more attention to private enterprise and less government interference. And while conservatives decried FDR's government expansion, radicals on the left argued that FDR's New Deal was not expansive enough. Among the most notable of his dissenters was Father Charles Coughlin, whose weekly radio show claimed 30 million regular listeners. When taken as a percentage of the population, Coughlin commanded a weekly audience that compares to the Super Bowls. Coughlin criticized FDR for pandering to banks and big businesses. He wanted nationalization of railroads and other major industries, and he favored guaranteed work and wages for all Americans. Coughlin's influence did find its way into policy. In 1938, FDR signed into law the first federal minimum wage of 25 cents an hour. Roosevelt was also criticized by Dr. Everett Townsend, who advocated for a financial safety net for Americans, especially the elderly. He proposed a federal old age pension program that met widespread support. Townsend, like Coughlin, saw some of his vision implemented as part of the New Deal. He's widely known as the father of Social Security, which was established in 1935. But the biggest political threat to Roosevelt came from a charismatic Louisiana senator named Huey Long. Long proposed an aggressive wealth redistribution program in the 1930s that would have imposed heavy taxes on the wealthy and redirected income to public welfare. The Share Our Wealth movement was at the heart of Long's plan to challenge Roosevelt for the presidency in 1936. Check out this video of one of Huey Long's 1934 speeches and consider how his ideas might have resonated with the average American in the throes of the Great Depression.
According to the tables which we have assembled, It is our estimate that 4% of the American people own 85% of the wealth of America, and that over 70% of the people of America don't own enough to pay the debts that they owe. How many men ever went to a barbecue and would let one man take off the table what's intended for 9/10 of the people to eat? The only way you'll ever be able to feed the balance of the people is to make that man come back and bring back some of that grub he ain't got no business with. Now, how are you going to feed the balance of the people? What's Morgan and Baruch and Rockefeller and Mellon going to do with all that grub? They can't eat it. They can't wear the clothes. They can't live in the house. Give them a yacht. Give them a palace. Send them to Reno and give them a new wife when they want it. If that's what they want. But when they've got everything on the God's living earth that they can eat and they can wear and they can live in, and all that their children can live in and wear and eat and all their children's children can use, then we got to call Mr. Morgan and Mr. Mellon and Mr. Rockefeller back and say, come back here. Put that stuff back on this table here that you took away from here, that you don't need. Leave something else for the American people to consume. And that's the program. We're not going to destroy the Gulf Refining Company. We're not going to destroy the Standard Oil Company. But we're going to say that the limit of any one man's stock ownership in the Standard Oil Company is from $3 to $5 million to that individual, and that the balance of the people of America own the balance of what the Standard Oil Company is worth. Then we start from the bottom. That the 25 or more million American families shall have a homestead, a home, and the comforts of a home, including an automobile and a radio, the things it takes in that house to live on. We say to America, 125 million, none shall be too big, none shall be too poor. None shall work too much. None shall be idle. No luxurious mansions empty. None walking the streets. None impoverished. None in pestilence. None in want. But in the land blessed by the smile of the Creator, with everything to be consumed, to be eaten, to be worn, that America will become a land sharing the fruits of the land, not for the favored few, not to satisfy greed, but that all may live in a land in which the Lord has provided an abundance sufficient for the luxury and convenience of the people in general, I think.
Of all of Roosevelt's critics, Long probably posed the most viable threat to FDR's power. However, the senator was assassinated in 1935, clearing the way for FDR to win re-election. Now, despite the opposition from the left and the right, FDR was a giant in American politics. The legacy of the Great Depression and the New Deal is the subject of our final big idea. FDR's New Deal left a lasting legacy in the United States. It set a new precedent for government involvement in the American economy and reorganized the major political parties. The legacy of FDR's New Deal is undeniable. The growth of the federal government during the 1930s set a precedent for expanding federal power that continued steadily for the next half century. The government's habit of deficit spending began in earnest during the Depression and has largely continued ever since. And the New Deal led to a massive reorganization of the major political parties. The Depression changed voting patterns in America and helped to create the modern Democratic Party. FDR assembled the New Deal Coalition, a diverse base of voters that were attracted to the Democratic Party by FDR and the New Deal. This coalition included labor unions and blue-collar workers, as well as intellectuals and academics. African Americans who were disproportionately affected by poverty during the Depression largely abandoned the Republican Party, to which they had been loyal since the Civil War. Rounding out the New Deal coalition were farmers and white Southerners, who remained Democratic voters until the presidencies of Nixon and Reagan in the 70s and 80s. As for the overall success of the New Deal, there remains debate among historians today. The majority of scholarship on the topic looks favorably on FDR and his policies. Most historians credit the New Deal with slowing the crisis, and many agree that his reform efforts were much needed. The success of his jobs programs are less clear. Sure, millions of Americans went back to work, but conservative historians point out that the government raised taxes to help pay for those programs. Many of those taxes, like excise taxes on alcohol, cigarettes, and groceries, disproportionately affected poor people. We should note, too, that the New Deal did not pull the country out of the Depression. For that, we have World War II to thank. That's a story for another day. Perhaps FDR's ultimate legacy can be found in his navigation of the country through some of its most trying moments. His programs weren't the sweeping economic revolution that Huey Long and Charles Coughlin may have wanted. But to Roosevelt's credit, he did not succumb to nor take advantage of the impulses of the desperate masses. The Great Depression was a global event, and in Europe, economic destitution gave rise to a generation of totalitarian dictators who promised desperate people economic prosperity in exchange for authority. That FDR saw the country through the Depression and left American democracy intact is no small feat. The Depression continues to be relevant in American society today. Some of the mistakes that caused it we have been careful to avoid. Others we have senselessly repeated. And for better or worse, the president has remained the focal point of the American economy ever since. Whether or not that is a sustainable way forward remains to be seen. Next time, we'll face another crisis and discuss America's involvement in the Second World War. See you then.